Hey guys, and welcome back to Castle Crush, and today we are going to be talking about the legendary cards in Castle Crush and which legendary is the best legendary card to have in Castle Crush. And I actually think there's a pretty definitive answer to this at the moment, but there's a lot of cards in between that I think still have a lot of discussion, and then there's a couple at the bottom that don't have a whole lot of purpose in the meta or only work with very specific decks and strategies. So let's start from the bottom and just work our way up without wasting too much time here. So at the very bottom, unfortunately, this was one of my favorite legendaries when it first came out, but it's more of a, it's not really something that works in a lot of meta-style decks, and that is the Dark Angel. And of course, the Dark Angel, it feeds off of weaker cards to make itself stronger. And it can be a good card, but for the cost of its mana, which is like 7 mana, there's just a lot of other things you can do with that 7 mana to, get a card or multiple cards that are going to be more relevant to a particular strategy. I think the Dark Angel is useful, but the problem is if you go up against the wrong type of deck, it's not that useful. It's really useful if you're playing against a skeleton type deck, but it's not very versatile against a number of different types of strategies, and if you're up against a different type of deck, it doesn't have that much use necessarily, and if you're not feeding it weaker cards, then the Dark Angel isn't actually that good. So that's kind of the problem with the Dark Angel, and kind of why you just don't really see it being used in a lot of the top decks at the moment. I don't even know. Like, I was trying to look through my recent matches and see if I played anyone who used a Dark Angel, and I don't feel like I have. Like, literally no one has used a Dark Angel that I've played against. And yeah, it's really weird, but I've tried using a Dark Angel a little bit, but again, something about it, it's just a little bit too costly for only working in certain situations. So from there, I would probably go to the Necromancer, and again, it has some legitimate strategies, but I mean, I like the Necromancer for playing with, especially in like the fun game modes, and it does have some legitimate strategies, but outside of those strategies, it's not particularly a useful card, and that's why the next card up here I'd probably put would be the Storm Elemental, because it's another card that works in very specific strategies, and if you're trying to use it outside of those strategies, you're just not going to have tons of luck, because it's a card that can be taken out very easily when it's first played, and often is just taken out immediately, so it's definitely a card that has to fit within the strategy of your deck, or else it's just not very useful. So, just like the Necromancer, if you have the Necromancer in a deck that doesn't fit this deck's strategy, it's not going to work as well as you might want it to. But it is possible that the Necromancer should be, sort of above the Storm Elemental in that regard, because I do think the Necromancer can fit more decks than the Storm Elemental can. So you have those cards. What would be next? Well, I will go ahead and put a spoiler alert that I think the Black Witch has definitely dropped from its previous position. The previous time I did this video, I ranked the Black Witch as the #1 legendary card. And that's definitely no longer the case, especially if you look at a lot of the prevalent decks out there. I think it's partly because it changed from sort of, the meta style changed from decks that are revolved around constantly countering what the opponent played to more decks that, just sort of try to win. It's pretty hard to sort of rank cards like this, especially since I think the legendaries, I don't know, to me, a lot of them are kind of bunched together, and I feel like, I guess the next one I should talk about is the Phoenix. And the Phoenix can obviously be a very useful card because it can clear skeletons, and it's also a relatively low mana ranged card with, good splash damage that can deal with skeleton. Yeah, well, like I said, skeletons But it can also work well placing it, say, behind a golem or behind some other sort of tanky card, and then it can clear, skeletons or whatever else it needs to clear behind it. So the Phoenix is a useful card, and it's good in different types of decks, not just necessarily only one strategy. It has a couple of different strategies, I think, that it can be actually used for. But at the same time, the Phoenix is still fairly weak. It's still a fairly weak card, and it's often a card that really does get targeted by your opponent fairly quickly, and if it gets caught out by itself, it's pretty weak. So it's still a card that is definitely not probably the best legendary card to have, but it is a fairly versatile one. So going up from there, maybe I'll say the Archer Queen. And I do see a lot of people very effectively using the Archer Queen. And she's a great card in that if you get her behind something, I mean, she can just really do a lot of damage and increases the ranged troops attack, like all your other ranged troops attack, which can be very, very useful. So I do think the Archer Queen works well in a number of different types of decks, but she's rather expensive. Her mana cost is rather expensive, and she isn't very good on her own. She has to be part of a strategy. I mean, many of these cards sort of do, but there's several that I think are at the top because I think they provide very versatile benefits to different types of decks. How many have we done? So I guess the next card I put is the Hollow Knight, and the Hollow Knight can be versatile in different types of decks as well. And the Hollow Knight, it's a low mana cost card that can actually perform pretty well as like as a skeleton clearer or an archer clearer. It can clear weak troops pretty easily. Obviously, the only downside to it is that it has to be, it can turn around. So that's the big downside, but it's pretty good at clearing early game troops that your opponent might play, assuming you can get it into a situation where it's not going to become your opponent's card. Next, I would probably put the Black Witch, and the Black Witch is dropped for several reasons, but I mean, I feel like one of the biggest ones is just that people know the Black Witch, and they have cards in their deck that can get rid of the Black Witch. And in addition to the fact that Poison can, also be, that's a newer card, and that can get rid of the Black Witch. But there's a lot of cards in the game that can get rid of the Black Witch very quickly, especially if it's the only thing in the lane. A Demon can get rid of it. An Inferno can obviously get rid of it. There's so many different things that can get rid of that card. The Fire Elemental is yet another card that was added to the game since I made that last video that can also be placed in, can be played to get rid of a Black Witch. And there's just so many different cards that can get rid of the Black Witch that her effect is still very powerful, but it has a lot of counters. She has a lot of counters to her, and the time that it takes her to perform her ability is rather slow, and she doesn't really do anything else other than her ability. That's the only thing she can do is her ability. So at this point, it's kind of, I don't know. She works in certain decks, but definitely does not work in other ones. So she definitely can't be a top tier card at the moment, I don't think. Depends what your deck is. Many of these depends what your deck is. I will say this right here. If you were doing a rushing deck, then obviously the legendaries you would consider would be like Vampire, Phoenix, Hollow Knight, and Storm Elemental. Obviously, you're not going to consider the higher mana ones, and obviously there would be a different list of sort of which ones are the best ones. We'll just go with the Shaman here. The Shaman is a very useful card, and it can be played with so many different types of strategies pretty decently, and you don't even necessarily have to play it behind something because its attack is strong enough that it can sort of 1v1 weaker troops pretty easily. So it doesn't necessarily have to have protection with it. Not the card, but I mean but it does work really well with cards like the Golem or just other cards that can be tankier and be played in front of it for sure. And it can just do a lot of damage. It does a fair bit of damage, so it's good to play for its mana cost, for doing things. From there, I would probably say the Valkyrie. Again, this is getting a little bit debatable for sure because it depends on your style of deck, but I do think that some Valk decks can be very powerful. And the Valkyrie serves multiple purposes because she's great against skeletons, but she also has a really powerful ability here. I still think the Skull Queen is pretty good. She did get nerfed. Previously, I would have said she was probably the number 2 card, but I think this only drops her down to maybe number 3 or number 4. In reality, I think she's still in the top 5 legendary cards in Castle Crush. And the reason why is because her ability to speed up the skeletons is still pretty good, and if you have a lot of skeletons, they can still do a lot of damage, and with her ability even doing half as much bonus damage as it did before, they're still good, and it's still a really good card to have in a skeleton deck. And skeleton decks can still be good for a variety of reasons. Number 1, because they work with the Necromancer, and number 2, because they work with the Spectre. So skeleton decks still have a lot of good cards to kind of mix together there that still make it worthwhile to include a Skull Queen. So I think she's still very good, and if you look at a lot of the top players, like, they're still using the Skull Queen. Maybe not as many of them, but there's still a lot of people who are using the Skull Queen. So I think she's still pretty good. From there, at number 2, I would probably put the Vampire. It's debatable where, but I think the Vampire is a top 5 card because at the end of the day, the Vampire, I mean, it's literally like, you know, it's a direct counter to so many different things. You know, if your opponent relies on a Hollow Knight in the early game, you can basically completely turn things around, or at least, you know, you force them to have to change their strategy if you play a Vampire. So obviously it's the direct counter to a Hollow Knight, one of the best counters. It's good at taking out skeleton swarms. It can work well, so it can work well if your opponent plays a Skull Queen deck. I mean, obviously if the skeletons are affected by the Skull Queen, then they can take out the Vampire. But if you're trying to stop a Skull Queen deck at the start, it can be effective for that as well. And it works good against a number of different high mana troop cards. So I think the Mud Elemental is the exception, but it works great against the Executioner. It works great against the Valkyrie. It can even work against the Dragon. The Vampire is just a very good card to sort of counter a lot of pushes that your opponent might make. And just, it's so useful to have in so many different situations where you're just not sure what card to play against something your opponent played. The Vampire is usually a good card if you can get them at close range. Like, no matter what they played, other than maybe a Mud Elemental, usually a good card to play. So, and then finally, in the number 1 spot, I feel like there shouldn't be that much debate about this card because I think it's by far the most used legendary if I look through decks of my opponents. My recent opponents plus top players in the game, that is the Dragon. I may have gotten the ranking wrong for a lot of these cards here, but I'm pretty sure the Dark Angel is the worst and the Dragon is the best. And I'm pretty sure those are probably true facts here. Because the Dragon is literally just the most used legendary card that I see in the widest variety of decks that are used. Now, obviously, it's not used in rushing decks very often, but it can be in special game modes. But it works in defensive decks. It works in counter-style decks. It works in so many different type of decks that can be really effective. It works in Valkyrie decks. The Dragon works in a lot of different decks. It works in, decks that revolve around just getting tons of mana cards out there. And the thing about the Dragon is it's good in so many different situations. It's a really strong card. It is the strongest card in the game. And it does, powerful single hit damage. It does powerful area of effect damage. Its attack is just good, and its ability is also really useful. So all around, the Dragon, I think this time claims the top spot pretty easily. It's just too good of a card at the moment. Depending on your strategy, of course, a lot of this is very dependent on your strategy. Obviously, if you're using a rushing deck, like I said, the order could be certainly different. But I think regardless, don't see that many people using the Dark Angel. So I feel like that one is definitely at the bottom. And then a lot of the rest of the cards are in between. But I still think the Skull Queen is a top tier card. I think Vampire is a good card. And I think that the Dragon is a good card. I think all three of those cards in particular are very good legendary cards. And the rest are more situational. I might put Valkyrie in 5 and then put Shaman as like 4th best. I know a lot of people still really like the Archer Queen, and then for rushing, obviously a lot of people like Hollow Knight, Phoenix, and Storm Elemental. So it's hard to really say for sure, but you get the idea. I think Dragon is definitely the best legendary out there. So anyways, that is going to do it for this list of the best legendary cards in Castle Crush. Obviously, I'm sure people have opinions, so leave a like if you enjoyed. Let me know what you thought in the comments about this video and what cards you would put in your top legendary spots as the most useful legendary cards in the game or the best legendary cards in the game. Maybe subscribe if you're new to my channel. And thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for more videos.